about it in terms of enabling conditions, to say what enabling conditions have to be in place for a community or institution to move into their adapted future. And so these are the ones that we've identified so far. They're similar to some frameworks I've seen out there, but we're talking about identifying cultural readiness, having a leadership with a champion with authority, having a certain level of investment capacity and knowledge in-house, some sufficient information and analysis, inclusive, engaged decision-making, and then operationally some systems of accountability and improvement. And so generally our members sort of agree on these. There's probably more out there, but they sort of fit into these categories. And today we're really sort of going to be talking about topics that might cover some of these middle areas: the investment capacity, knowledge, sufficient information and analysis, and inclusive and engaged decision making. What we decided as a group is that if these are our problems that we want to try to solve, we want to solve them somehow. We want to foster an enabling condition. What would we do from our vantage point and as an ASAP member group to intervene in some way that could foster an enabling condition on a larger scale, because we're thinking big here. And so we came up with two main objectives. Last meeting, we talked in pretty good detail about different frameworks, different program examples for how to do peer-based support and professional development, because we said a lot of our peer practitioners could use peer-based support either for knowledge transfer, sharing, professional training, but also just support in a really deep and authentic way. And so we talked in detail about that. But today, we're shifting to the other objective. So number one here, when we had our little strategic planning session, that's one of the things that popped out was that people really felt like the barrier around information and analysis, in other words, data, mostly data, other information as well, is a real barrier for a lot of organizations and communities to get to their adaptive future. Some of them get really stuck there either because they don't have technical capacity or money to deal with it, or it's just really time consuming. It could take a long time. And so we talked about developing a comprehensive list of information and decision tools, sort of as a precursor to the larger goal, which is really to communicate and distribute sort of a wish list to agencies that fund and conduct research and development, so that we could try to fill those gaps. And so last call that I had with Sebastian, who's the lead of this group, and he'll probably be joining us, we said, well, not everybody's super into data. I am, some of you might be, but as a larger topic, we think that talking to that ASAP members could potentially come up with some good ideas to talk with agencies about in general, about what's missing in the adaptation world that we could potentially have a more strategic roadmap for some of these funding agencies to help us fill. And so the conversation today is broader than data, but we are going to have a very specific example about data. And so today I'm kind of facilitating and speaking a little, and then I'll introduce our other speaker. We're going to share examples of efforts that are mining accessible data to help communities make adaptation decisions. I don't know if you all are like me, but I feel like every time I go to my inbox, there's another cool database, data source, cool tool, solving a piece of the puzzle, and further overwhelming most of the world, but really cool stuff. So we're going to dive into a couple of examples. We're going to discuss how ASAP members can inform relevant agencies about data gaps, but then we want to go more broadly, like I said, and discuss how we as ASAP members can collectively influence and engage the right agencies to align, potentially so they can align their resources for big adaptation needs and not just data. So as we're talking, you can think about in your own work, you have boots on the ground, what do you, if you could influence a funder or somebody who's building the things you need built, what would you want? What's on your wish list? But let's dive into data for a bit. So in some of my work, a lot of my work is in developing, doing work for communities that involves the development of data, the analysis of data to make really good adaptation decisions. That's the whole point. And so, just diving into sort of a problem statement here when it comes to data is that, like I said before, analyzing adaptation can be difficult and time consuming. There are a lot of types of data that I look at when I'm trying to support a community or an institution. And that could include climate exposure data, that could be pretty technical scientific data, impact data, that's sort of a mix of sociological potentially and health and scientific data. Community concerns and priorities, that might be more sociological, qualitative. It might involve more surveys, workshops, and compiling that kind of information. There's adaptive capacity, there's population sensitivity. All of these have different kinds of indicators. And it also involves an aggregation, usually of best practices and strategy examples, so you can make good recommendations. And then once you're done with your planning, you're actually doing the work. You're tracking your progress in some way. And then ideally, you even have access to real-time emergency alerts as you're continuing along in your adaptation, hopefully adapted life. So that's a lot of types of data. There's a lot of subtypes within that. And there's an overwhelming number of sources. And so I think I was a National Adaptation Forum where I heard the statistic of 30,000 different climate-related databases. But they could include databases. They can include, I go in and I look at raw data occasionally in studies. I prefer not to. I prefer for somebody to have pre-calculated it. So I like a pre-calculated data set. Sometimes I mine information out of reports, either local or state or national, where I have to sort of pull out from a narrative certain statistics that might be relevant for a community. And then, the great thing is when I can find a really cool decision support tool that might even give me a cool chart and map that I can use with some really good figures that are credible. The problem too is that even when you have access to the information, to analyze it requires a certain level of technical expertise. That's a barrier for some. Some of the communities I work with are tribes and don't have a lot of in-house capacity. Many institutions and communities get stuck for too long there and they might spend too much money. And so a lot of my interest and sort of really passionate about this is that I'd love to see communities and institutions spend less time here on data analysis and finding data and figuring out what indicators they need, and more time on making inclusive, values-based decisions, with deep community engagement and then moving on to action. And so I am sure many of you in your work can relate to this. We've talked about it many times in this group. Lots of people are sick of getting stuck in data. So I want to just give it my example first, and I'm going to hand it over to Alex. I mentioned that I do some work here in this area, and so I am the lead consultant under the Paul Abandoned Mission Indians for a national federally funded program called the Tribal Climate Health Project. And so as I was building capacity building resources for tribes around the country to do their own climate and health adaptation work, I decided it's not enough for me to just guide people, talk to people about all the information that exists. I needed to organize my thoughts together in a process that would work for communities. And I use this now in my work with when I do adaptation plans for communities. And so I developed something called the Exposures, Impacts, and Strategies Inventory Tool for the Tribal Climate Health Project. And so before I said, one of our objectives was to sort of inventory what's there. That's partially kind of what I'm doing by default, because what I'm trying to do here is to collect all the indicators and data sources for the types of things that a community needs to know about so they can make good decisions. I'm trying to hopefully help them not have blind spots on really important impacts for them so that they can invest in the right areas and get started on the right types of work. And so this is a worksheet. It's in Excel. This is nothing fancy. It's built to be a worksheet that people can actually plug information into as they find it, but it generally highlights indicators and data sources for climate exposures, impacts that are inclusive of health, social, natural, and built environments, and adaptive capacity and population sensitivity. And so if you've ever done this work, it's not fun to start from scratch. It really helps to at least know, what this tool does. If you just select your region, you will have a populated, sort of filtered list of potential exposures coming your way. For me, I label exposures as temperature extremes, wildfire, storms and flooding, drought, melting ice and sea level rise, and then I have a series of secondary exposures so it's built to show a relational cascade of climate effects. So if we know the exposures, we know something about potential secondary exposures, we know something about impacts. And so it'll be up to the community to go in look at the recommended potential exposures and impacts, and look at the data sources for those to confirm how severe or likely those are, and make some decisions about prioritization. That's a really short story for what can be a potentially long process, but what I have here is hundreds. I've looked at all the best research literature sources for trying to mine what the most important indicators are for these areas and where the best data is on a national basis, trying to find the data that can be downscaled as much as possible. And so through that work, I have been able, I gathered a team of advisors, and so I have advisors all over the country that are helping me on the Tribal Climate Health Project, and I got connected with the folks at Temperate, because I was told that Temperate is doing something sort of similar. They're trying to shortcut the process for communities as well. And so I want to introduce Alex Lash again from Azavia. We are now working together on a project that we just got a USDA grant to try to increase some functionality in the Temperate system, to basically include more of the indicators and impacts that I've been talking about doing research on, so that communities have a more comprehensive picture of their adaptation needs, and they tie it together with strategies as well. And they put it together in an entire decision tool. So it's a web-based tool. I'm going to let Alex talk to you more about it, but we're really excited about the potential for this tool, which is really a leader in the country, to shortcut the process, make this easier, overcome that burden of information and analysis. Okay, Alex, take it away.
Thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to try and share my screen, see how this goes. Are you able to share the, are you able to unshare, Angie?
Oh, sure, yeah. Thanks.
Cool. Try that again. Oh, great. Okay. Great. And can everybody see our little dog?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Temperate. As Angie said, our main goal with Temperate is to make data easier to access and decision-making easier to access for communities. Obviously, I don't need to say that the climate data landscape is complex, and so a lot of the challenges that Angie was talking about, we are also experiencing as we try to build out this product. So I won't talk too much about Temperate, but just to give you a little bit of context, Temperate is a subscription-based decision-making support tool. So I'm going to focus more on the approach that we're taking and the data challenges we're seeing. But it is designed for small to mid-sized cities and towns, usually with planning, limited planning resources, and is meant to be a little bit more of like a Kickstarter for generalists who are starting to create vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans. So we try to kind of lead them through that process. One of the big ways in which we do that is we made sure to contextualize the climate data in that decision-making process. So we kind of went with a two-pronged approach. So we are visualizing the climate data, with charts and sometimes with actual statements about what the data is trying to tell somebody, and also put the indicators of the projected climate change in the actual decision-making process. So that kind of keeps everything front and center of where communities are actually planning and making their decisions. And like Angie was talking about with her tool, based on the national climate assessment and a community's location, we try to show what a user's potential top concerns might be. So that's at least how we're trying to do that. So that gives them some potential priorities and gives them a starting point when they get dropped into this application and are meant to start building out a vulnerability assessment and their adaptation plan. We also, the second part of this kind of two-pronged approach is we have a strong bias towards action. So we just received a grant to refine and add this feature to the Climate Explorer. So we're finding that, we're guessing that this type of suggested starting point seems to have some real value. But we're also within the application using some, trying to help people actually get a sense of what action they can actually take based on the climate data. One thing that we are seeing, however, and I think that this kind of came up when Angie was talking as well, is that there is a bit of a lack of confidence in interpreting the climate science data. So even if it is easily accessible, both in terms of actually, like I said, being kind of integrated into the application, and even if it's made more accessible, through design and ease of use, in reality, most people, we are finding, at least in our experience, don't want to use a tool like this without the assistance of an adaptation professional. And a lot of the people we talk to rely on a local university, maybe, to provide them with key findings and the interpretation of the data. So some of this was expected when we were building out the tool initially. We have this Ask an Expert button that we made available on all pages of the application. So that way somebody could reach out if they were having trouble, or if they had kind of a question about some of the information that they're seeing, so they could get more custom help. But we have found that we're getting very few people actually emailing us. In fairness, they would be emailing ICLEI, and then it would be CC'd to us. But our assumption, I think, that people would be just going through this and maybe have kind of ad hoc questions has seemed to be less the case. So what we're finding is that the reality is the majority of our users are users because they were contracted with, they had a contract with ICLEI to provide them a vulnerability assessment for somewhere in between like $10,000 or $15,000. So they're using Temperate as a part of that process, and they still kind of have somebody guiding them through it. One thing that I touched on earlier, but I want to talk about a little more deeply, is what I meant by keeping things pretty action-oriented. So we created this suggested actions feature, which shows users strategies that other communities are taking in relation to things like maybe they're in a similar geographic region, and especially if it relates to the hazard, or what we call a hazard, but I think Angie was referring to as exposures. Trying to like draw those connections between them, so that way they have, again, more of a starting point with some of the actions that they could undertake. So we're trying to show users other strategies from communities, again, in kind of like the same geographic region or similar geographic region, and in relation to the thing that they are trying to assess. So the idea behind this was that it could shortcut some of the research that communities have to do to find strategies that are being created by others, so they could learn from them and start their own plans. To this end, we're trying to grow a database of strategies. This obviously isn't a new idea. Adaptation International and a few others have been involved in a similar effort a few years back. But of course, we're interested in doing this because we feel that it has a lot of potential to accelerate learning from each other. And ultimately it could be like open and make sure that people are, have access to things that worked, things that didn't work. Our current database is based on research of Missy Stoltz and Sierra Woodruff, and we've made it possible for people who are using the application to share any strategies that they try to undertake within the application. So then other people could get access to them. That of course requires, a willingness to share what people are trying. But ideally we'll be able to kind of keep adding to this database. So some of the gaps that are still here, or some of the gaps that we would love to fill, are things like implementation information. Obviously, it would be great if people could share a little more detail about the actions that they're undertaking. Things like progress measures, like what budgets people are looking at, and also many communities don't have action plans yet, and so a lot of those that do might not have peers in terms of their actual budget size, so that can also cause some difficulty in terms of just sharing some of this information. And then kind of lastly, kind of understandably, a lot of cities and towns might not want to share things that didn't work for them or share their failures. Of course, that makes sense, especially if they're using public funds. But, of course, we would hope that sharing that would be more useful than for other people who might be interested in taking on an action. So these are some of the areas I think that we're still working through. Yeah. And I don't know if anyone has questions or if you want to take over, Angie. That's kind of all I've got.
Yeah, any specific questions for Alex would be great. I'm going to dive into more thoughts on gaps, and I'd actually like to hear from other folks too, what they're experiencing. But yeah, questions for Alex.
Yeah, hi Alex, it's Lois Conway here. I'm just wondering if you see any applications for architects for your tool. Say someone working on say a medium-sized commercial project. You know, how potentially could an architect use your tool?
Yeah. That's a really good thought. I mean, one thing that we definitely try to do is when people are starting to use the application, they can identify certain community systems that might be a focus of theirs or that they think might be most important to where they are, and kind of be basing a lot of their decision making around those things. So it kind of tries to match, again, like based on like location, like certain hazards that you probably should watch out for, but then get you to think through those things in relation to whatever that focus is. Does that answer your question?
Well, you know, in Canada, most of the emphasis now, you know, has been on, you know, providing engineers with the background in this area. So the engineers in Canada have moved ahead pretty quickly. They have a certificate in resilient design. It's only available to engineers. So I think architects don't have that kind of program support in Canada. And, you know, I think something useful generally for architects anywhere is, you know, a climate data tool that would support, for instance, some research into heat, because we're looking at, you know, increasing temperatures, and you know, design for increasing heat will be a big concern. So that's one specific area that would be, I think, a major concern. And how do we access the data to address that problem? I guess then for architects too, it's taking that data and then translating that into into a life for the building. You know, how far out does the data extend? If we're looking at a 50-year or even a 100-year building, does the data extend out that far? Mm-hmm. And then, you know, we'll need to make some, I guess, some assumptions. The further out the projection, I guess, the less reliable the data. So I think for architects, there's a lot of issues involved in using data. And then the big challenge, of course, is translating that data into, into either something in a building code, may or may not be addressed in a current building code. So there's a lot of challenges for architects in starting to work through this process.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's very interesting. That makes a lot of sense.
I think, you know, the tool is really helpful for anybody who wants to know the conditions with which they will do any work, you know, development included. There is a question from Chris Clavin that he chatted. He says, thanks for the presentation, Alex. Do you or your colleagues have any recorded webinars posted? Would you like to share with my colleagues? I'm sure you do.
Sure. Yeah, I'll talk to, I should also mention that Jess, the project manager for this product, I'm sure she'd be open to talk to anybody if you have deeper questions. So I'll reach out to her and see if I can get some webinars to share or more information.
He also asked if you've trialed piloted this with infrastructure owners or operators. I think it's mainly you've been focused on community scale, yeah. But you don't exclude operators.
Yeah, absolutely not. Yeah, I mean, we were focusing primarily on cities, especially initially, and getting communities using it and going through this process. But yeah, definitely not exclusive to that.
Yeah, well, Alex, Yep, this is Louis here again. Yeah, people who, facility managers are very interested in this kind of data. People who've a lot of money invested in various kinds of assets and need to be budgeting for, say future mechanical systems or upgrades in their system or upgrades in their building envelope. They're very interested in this kind of data and the implication it has for, for actually managing that facility. And they'll be projecting out 10, 20 years, not as long as maybe the full life of the building, but they'll be at least going out 10 years anyway.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
This was intended to not really be a sales pitch, although we are happy to introduce you to the tool. And if you want more information, that's really great. I think it's wonderful. That's why I'm working with them. But really, this is an example of one attempt at a solution to a big institutional barrier. And so, if we're going back to that chart, this helps us both in internal capacity, it helps us with information and analysis, and it helps us with decision making. So a lot of those needs are sort of being addressed, or in some ways here. There are other tools and systems as well out there. I want to give an opportunity for anybody out here in our call to suggest other things that they use in their work to try to accelerate the process, to maybe economize so that you're not having to remine the data over and over and over again that other people have potentially already mined.
This is Shamika with the Nature Conservancy. I had a couple of questions. So the first is, does it cost users anything to actually use or access the tool? That's the first question. The second question is your community specifically defined? So like, who are your users specifically? Who were the people who you engaged to use the tool and how? Or was it just people that were a part of that study or whatever program you had mentioned before? And then lastly, where was the data mined from? One of the things that I come up with a lot when I'm talking to community members is that they are very, they're to question where the data is from, especially if it's something that requires funding and state and local funding. So different data sources say different numbers or different measurement goals that communities need to hit. And it's not always clear to people what data set they can be using in order to access said funding.
Alex, do you want to answer that, the data source question?
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't sure if that was for Angie or for me. So the second part, I can actually share a link to our methodology page, and that's going to give a lot more detailed information than I can. But would you mind repeating the first part of the question? It was, I believe, around who we were doing, like which communities we were doing the work with. Is that correct?
But she was asking, it is right now, there's a free trial. And then after the free trial is over, there's a subscription. We are all looking at grants as much as we can, because we know that that's difficult for a lot of communities. And so that's sort of one of their goals.
I think that, yeah, that says it pretty succinctly. We have like a, I think it's a 15-day free trial. So that way people can actually try it out and make sure it works for them. And if they have questions, they can, of course, reach out to us. But yeah, and then after that it is a subscription based.
And in terms of data sources, I will tell you in my tool, when I point folks to data sources, there's a lot of them. I'm pretty picky about what I use. I used to work inside of a government at a county level, and I know that I would get squashed in half if I used some kind of not credible source. And so I typically go to federal, state agencies primarily. Okay. Well, let's continue on this discussion, because like I said, we're not just talking about data, but we hope that this wet the whistle a little bit in terms of, okay, here's one way we're trying to address a big adaptation gap or a big set of needs. If you can unshare, maybe you already did, and I'll go ahead and reshare. All right, folks, can you see my screen? Yep, okay. So these are the gaps in my work that I see, and I think they may be relatable. In general, good decision support tools require meaningful data. Sometimes the meaningful data doesn't exist, at least not in the way that we need it. And so, for example, I wish that I could find an annual average, often annual averages that are tied to the climate event. For example, I wish I knew not just what an annual average rate of asthma was for a community. I wish I knew how many asthma cases happened during a particular heat wave or during a wildfire. Spatial scales aren't often location specific enough. So like I use Climate Explorer, I use CDC, has some really good pieces of data, and a lot of them are health related, but not all of them. They go down to the county level. When I work with tribes, the county level information isn't always super meaningful. So sometimes it's not downscaled enough. Temporal scales differ, and that means sometimes a really good data source will give you an awesome baseline, but it won't have any historical information. Or maybe a website does a really good job of doing projections, but it doesn't provide you any historical data. And so ideally, in my adaptation work, I like to show a trend from what used to happen to what's expected to happen, and sometimes there's gaps. And sometimes the data that I want just isn't being gathered at all. So for example, I really wish I could find credible national grid cell pre-calculated data, like I said, for asthma cases during heat waves, particulate matter during wildfires, population relocation or displacement figures that's tied actually to climate events, pollen count trends, algal bloom trends, groundwater and aquifer levels, crop productivity trends. You would think I could find. It's a little tricky. Threatened species, production rates and trends, those are around, but it's a lot of work to get to them. And local food insecurity and shortages, I find that on a national scale, but I don't find that necessarily at a community scale. So that's just some examples of I have a much longer list of wishes of data that I wish was there. And so in my work, I actually try to communicate some of that. And so it got me thinking, like, wouldn't it be great if the folks that fund and do data and research had some sort of a roadmap, a wish list of their own that they were using to tie their assets to strategically tackle these gaps. And I'm asking around. I was at the National Adaptation Forum, talked to a guy at the National Institutes of Health, and asked him after his presentation, hey, is there something like that? Do you guys have like a running list of things you're trying to check off because there's really immediate needs and we need to address them? And he said, we wish we had a wish list. So I just suggested it, and I keep suggesting it everywhere I go. It's presented at the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists and the CDC this past a few months ago, presented the same thing. There's another couple of organizations that could actually set up at least epidemiological standards. So they could set up, what indicators are really standard for epidemiologists around the country that are doing climate work, and then we could set to work on the data sources and make sure the research is in place. So at some point in the research timeline, either raw data, pre-calculated data tools, somehow it would be nice to get started funding some of those elements. But that's just me, and I actually we're waiting to hear back on a grant to produce some climate and health data gap inventory information to agencies. Who knows if I get it, but still, I think there would be a lot of power in working together to address needs like this. And so I'm not the only one out here doing this kind of work. I would actually think ASAP is a really perfect organization that could be taken more seriously and could organize its thoughts around, regularly presenting recommendations to federal agencies, foundations, others who are funding or conducting this kind of work. And so that was sort of the genesis behind this objective is, can we get there? Can we work together to kind of identify some really key gaps and then come up with this wish list and then actually have some conversations or do something that's influential with these agencies so that they can align their resources. So I want to stop there and stop for discussion. Thoughts in general about this topic and about our ability as an ASAP group to tap into this, and if you have energy in it to pursue, to work with us and pursue some of this.
Yeah, it's Lois Conway here. Yeah, one big data consumer is the various building rating systems. For instance, LEED is is probably the longest established building rating system, and they're constantly developing pilot programs for new credits. So that's one big data consumer. I'm just talking about kind of data consumers from an architectural perspective. Another data consumer would be the WELL building standard. And that would, that's been established, that was established, I think, in 2012, 2014. It's been around for a few years, but that standard too is going to be relying on climate and health-related data. So those are all potential, sources of funding for people doing research in the data area. The other area, of course, for data would be architects and designers. And I think the data right now is primarily oriented toward people who are planners. But I think there's a big need to kind of package data in a form that's usable, by architects and other designers, that kind of keys into various phases in the design process.
Can you give me an example of a data gap that would really be amazing if it were filled for you?
Yeah, one example, let's see. Well, heat, for instance, the temperature increases would be, like just that example I referred to previously would be, designing for increasing temperatures. Now, if you were to take, most of the projections go out to about 2050. But for instance, say for a larger institutional building, maybe you're going out to, further than that, 2100. So temperature data is key in putting a building together. So that's one example. Another example would be, anything that's related to data related to wildfire, and that could help us predict perhaps frequency of wildfire. So data related to wildfire might be something like, is there an active program in the area that's clearing combustible material off the ground? Are the communities active in seeking funds, from emergency management or organizations to address wildfire concerns? Any data related to drought would be directly relevant to wildfire. Anyway, so in terms of a building type, designing for a building, heat's a major concern, I'd say, because it implies that we need to, design buildings that are perhaps better insulated, or that have heat. Perhaps public facilities need heat shelter. So the heat has a lot of implications for how buildings are designed. At the community level, wildfire would be a major concern in up and down the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington State, and up into BC and across the Arctic. So anything that consolidates wildfire data is going to be of major interest to funding agencies in Canada and across the US, just consolidating that data.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Would anybody else like to chime in about their work, what they're seeing, and if you think this something like this could be helpful? Actually, Lily, if you're still on the line, so Lily is a staff person of ASAP. Have you seen ASAP do some of this, meaning kind of put together a platform that it might share with agencies in terms of here's what the practitioners are saying they need? Any kind of wish lists? Have we done that before?
Yeah, so, it is an area that ASAP, I think, is really interested in. I don't know that we've done exactly that, Angie, but we did just get a grant from Lisa focused on private sector service providers in the Great Lakes. And really what we're going to be doing with that is focusing on bringing in private sector service providers and training them on using Lisa-related data sources, but kind of with a larger goal and perspective of really this kind of need and gap of, there's so many, as we've been talking about, excellent public sources of climate data, and they're really underutilized. So, and as the field is growing at ASAP, we're noting more and more service providers popping up and, really wanting to get better consistency and access to the best sources of data and, provide training and consensus building. So maybe all the different service providers and different subsectors aren't starting from scratch and are really taking advantage of the data sources that are out there. So, we're going to be working on a fairly, it's a specific portion of that issue through this grant. But yeah, I think it's something that ASAP is pretty well positioned to engage in and is of a lot of interest.
Can folks still on the line, could you just use your chat box and write the word data if this is something that you think you'd like to work with us on, if you'd like to be part, if this turns into some kind of a subgroup or something. The work would look like trying to come up with the top list of data needs that we would like agencies to know about so we can attempt to tackle them. So just write data in the chat box so we know who you are. And then before we close, I want to open this up, like I said, more broadly. So when I talked to Sebastian about this topic just earlier this week, it really dawned on us this idea of ASAP having that level of influence with agencies applies to a lot more than just data. So yes, we could probably do a good job because we're the practitioners of suggesting data gaps, but what other gaps are there? You have boots on the ground in your work. What scalable difference could we make in the work of adaptation if we were to fill other gaps? So I would just open it up for a conversation around other types of gaps you wish we could find a way to fill. Or maybe I'll put it a different way. If you could have a conversation with the nation's biggest funders, what would you tell them? How would you tell them to align their funding? What types of solicitations would you like to see?
This is Shamika with the Nature Conservancy. I think I would like to see major funders inject their money more into local community organizations and projects that are really working to build resilience at the local level. A lot of what we're seeing is hesitation and pause at the higher levels of government. And I feel like there's a lot going on at municipal, state levels even, that I feel like major funders could really potentially help shift
the narrative in certain communities if there was more money injected towards, you know, the resources that they needed.
Yeah, when I was working in a county, we put together a legislative platform, and then we go ship that around to all of our decision makers, and thinking, you know, something like that, and that could be a priority is, you know, better funding access for local communities for adaptation work. So maybe take a second, just, you know, if we were to do some kind of something collective here as an ASAP group, do you all think a platform like that would work, or how would we be most effective in influencing influencing these agencies that can help? Well, these are big questions that probably require some thought. So I'm glad we've had a chance to wet the whistle a little bit on these topics. I think there's a lot of value that can be produced here in this topic. So I'm looking forward to working with folks that are interested in it to kind of refine a little bit what our objectives is gonna be here. Are there any final thoughts by anybody in the group before we sign off today? All right, well, I really appreciate everybody's time. Thanks again to Alex for joining us, and we hope you'll join us for our next meeting next month.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Angie.
Okay, thank you very much.